Power, intrigue, and destiny intertwined in the life of Emperor Nero, the last scion of the illustrious Julio-Claudian dynasty. His name, like a shadow, still hovers over the pages of history, sparking debates and giving rise to legends. Nearly 2 millennia later, it remains one of the most recognizable in the annals of humanity, perhaps second only to the great Julius Caesar. His reign is shrouded in scandals, unrestrained revelry, and ruthless political assassinations. In popular memory, he is forever immortalized as the ruler who supposedly played the lyre while the Great Fire of 64 AD consumed the heart of Rome itself. But was that truly the case? The answer to this question, like many others, lies in the details of his remarkable biography. Nero was born on December 15, 37 AD, in Antium, a picturesque town near the Eternal City. His childhood began tragically. His father passed away when the future emperor was just 2 years old. However, fate had an unexpected turn in store for young Nero. When his mother remarried the reigning emperor Claudius, this event proved truly decisive. Claudius, at his new wife's insistence, adopted the boy as his own son, instantly elevating Nero to an unprecedented position within the Roman aristocracy. When the day came for Nero to be proclaimed the new emperor, he was only 16 years old, an age at which few could bear the burden of such immense power. His mother, Agrippina, a woman of unyielding will and ruthless ambition who knew no moral boundaries in her pursuit of power, skillfully wove a web of intrigues and conspiracies to elevate her son to the imperial throne. It was said that she did not hesitate to engage in a liaison with one of Claudius's most trusted freedmen, Pallas, to persuade him to facilitate her marriage to the emperor. And once this strategic alliance was forged, Agrippina, with unstoppable determination, directed all her efforts toward securing Nero's status as Claudius's undisputed successor. She stopped at nothing to ensure her son ascended the throne. And once her cunning plan reached its climax, with Nero's position as heir undeniably secured, Agrippina unhesitatingly removed the final obstacle, ending Emperor Claudius's life with poison. Given her past, it was easy to see that Agrippina was the driving force behind the young emperor's actions, and this is precisely how events unfolded during the first few years of his reign. She effectively wielded power, guiding her son. There is evidence that she even accompanied him to the Senate, where she was permitted to listen to proceedings from behind a curtain. On one coin, we can see images of Nero and Agrippina facing each other, almost creating the impression of their joint rule. However, it is noteworthy that only her name and titles were engraved on the obverse side of the coin. The emperor's own name and titles were relegated to the reverse. Nero, as it turned out, showed very little interest in state administration, leaving the effective control of imperial affairs in the hands of his highly competent freedmen, who, incidentally, had been chosen by his mother. This allowed him to dedicate himself to his true passions, poetry, acting, and, of course, participating in chariot races at the Circus Maximus. Initially, everything went quite smoothly. The transfer of power from Claudius to Nero was completely seamless. Nero, after all, was Augustus's great-great-grandson, and he modestly declined the numerous honorary titles bestowed upon him by the Senate. However, shortly after Nero's ascension to the throne in 54 AD, the Armenian king was overthrown by the powerful Parthian Empire, and a Parthian prince was placed on the Armenian throne. As Armenia was a client state of Rome at the time, this action was considered a direct declaration of war. In response to the situation, presumably acting under his mother's influence and guidance, Nero decided to dispatch significant military forces to the region, entrusting command to the talented General Corbulo. After a series of complex and at times dramatic events, as well as intense military actions, Corbulo successfully restored stability and peace in this strategically important area. The culmination of these efforts was the conclusion of a long-awaited peace treaty between powerful Rome and influential Parthia. According to the terms of this agreement, the future ruler of Armenia, although to be nominated by Parthia, was required to travel to Rome for an official coronation, which the Roman emperor himself was to perform. Thus, in effect, any Parthian prince aspiring to the Armenian throne had to journey to the Eternal City and, demonstrating submission, kneel before the Roman emperor to receive his rightful crown. In the early years of his reign, Nero effectively remained a figure largely devoid of genuine independence, a kind of puppet ruler whose actions were often directed externally. Instead of focusing on matters of state, he increasingly immersed himself in his personal pursuits, artistic inclinations and hedonistic, sensual passions. Among his scandalous actions, the practice of taking the wives of noble senators as concubines was widely known, causing deep dissatisfaction and outrage in Roman society. His mother, Agrippina, made desperate efforts to deter her son from such provocative behavior. She astutely recognized an alarming similarity between Nero's habits and the notorious behavior of her own brother, keenly aware that such profligacy ultimately led to his sudden and violent murder. However, Nero, weary of his mother's constant interference and intrusive guardianship, began to act. In alliance with his closest confidants and wise advisors, the philosopher Seneca, who was his tutor and mentor, and Burrus, one of the influential praetorian prefects, he began systematically undermining the pervasive power Agrippina held over him. Their strategy began with the sequential removal of key figures from Agrippina's inner circle. The first victim was Pallas, the influential freedman of the late Emperor Claudius. Pallas held a very significant position in the imperial administration, effectively controlling imperial finances and wielding immense influence. A man whose absolute loyalty to Nero was beyond doubt was immediately appointed in his place. Agrippina found herself at the center of public humiliation. During Nero's official audience with an envoy from Armenia, she attempted to take a seat beside the emperor, but was emphatically refused. This event deeply shook her, and she realized that her once unshakable power over her son was inexorably slipping away. In a desperate attempt to regain her influence, she began openly expressing sympathy for and supporting Britannicus, the biological son of the late Claudius. This move was immediately interpreted as an unambiguous threat to Nero, who well remembered how he himself had ascended the throne. His mother could very well use the same tactic to elevate Britannicus. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Nero ordered Britannicus's poisoning and demanded that his mother immediately leave the imperial palace. Thus, the era of the struggle for regency finally concluded. During the same period, Nero began to feel a strong attraction to Poppaea, the wife of one of his closest friends, Otho, who would later himself ascend to the imperial throne. It should be recalled that Nero already had a legal wife, Octavia, Claudius's daughter. However, Nero never harbored genuine affection for her, though her presence held immense symbolic significance, providing an appearance of stability and continuity of power. Even in exile, Agrippina continued to be a source of deep fear for Nero. He made a firm decision to put an end to her once and for all. Together with his trusted advisors, he meticulously planned a treacherous plot to murder his own mother. He sent Agrippina on a sea voyage across the Bay of Naples on a boat that was specially designed to fall apart during the trip. However, when this occurred, Agrippina displayed incredible resilience and managed to swim to the safety of the shore. Having failed, Nero was forced to dispatch a detachment of guards to complete the task and finally eliminate his mother. Agrippina's demise marked fundamental changes in the empire's political life. Emperor Nero's advisors, the prominent figures of their time Seneca and Burrus, viewed this event with extreme disapproval. However, their influence gradually waned as Nero increasingly immersed himself in his favorite pursuits, amateur theatrical performances and thrilling chariot races. When Burrus died in 61 AD, and a year later Seneca decided to retire, the emperor lost his last restraining influences. Nero's new confidants quickly realized that the ruler craved public attention and thunderous applause, and their own position and power directly depended on their ability to secure this widespread adoration. It is widely believed that Poppaea played a significant role in Agrippina's tragic death, at the very least by instigating Nero to get rid of his mother. The emperor's affection for Poppaea steadily grew, and a decision was made for them to marry. However, two serious obstacles stood in the way of this union. First, Nero was already married, and Poppaea was also married. To remove these obstacles, Octavia, the emperor's wife, was accused of adultery. She was then immediately divorced and executed. When Poppaea's husband was sent to govern a province in Spain, Nero and Poppaea were finally able to enter into a legal marriage. In 60 AD, a large-scale rebellion erupted in Britain, led by Boudicca. The main cause of this revolt was that upon the death of the Iceni chief, he had bequeathed his tribe to be divided and inherited by his two daughters in Rome. However, Roman officials stationed in Britain completely disregarded the deceased's will. They invaded the tribe's lands, accompanied by violence and plunder. Both daughters of the chief were raped. The queen of the tribe, Boudicca, united her allies and amassed a colossal army, estimated by some to number between 80 and 100,000 people. At that historical moment, the Roman governor of Britain, Suetonius, was engaged in a military campaign in modern-day Wales, which caused some delay in his reaction to the growing threat. Boudicca managed to burn down 3 of the most significant Roman settlements in Britain before she was defeated by Suetonius's army, which, although significantly smaller, perhaps numbering between 10,000 and 20,000 soldiers, consisted of hardened veterans who had been confronting local British tribes for years. However, despite his impeccable service and successful suppression of the largest rebellion in Britain during Roman rule, Suetonius was unexpectedly removed from office. This likely occurred because his successes and fame began to overshadow the emperor himself. It is noteworthy that, although the reigning emperor was characterized by vanity, depravity, and cruelty, his personal qualities and actions had little bearing on the affairs of distant provinces. Thus, Boudicca's rebellion had little direct connection to the emperor himself. Instead, it was a direct consequence of dissatisfaction with the local Roman administration. Emperor Nero, instead of attending to state affairs, dedicated his time to perfecting his singing and lyre playing, and regularly performed as an actor at private events. From a modern perspective, such hobbies might not seem reprehensible, but for a Roman citizen, and especially for the head of state, such pursuits were the height of dishonor and disgrace. For acting, as well as any other public performance, was often equated with the base profession of prostitutes in Roman society at the time. The ancient Roman virtues, so highly esteemed by the Senate and all of society, such as dignitas, dignity, gravitas, seriousness, pietas, piety, and virtus, valor, were trampled upon and desecrated by the supreme authority itself, the emperor. Just 4 years after Boudicca's rebellion in Britain, in 64 AD, a true catastrophe struck the imperial capital itself. The Great Fire erupted in Rome, reportedly starting among the shops located near the famous Circus Maximus. This destructive blaze consumed 2/3 of the city. It took 6 days to bring the inferno under control, but soon the fire reignited and raged for another 2 days, continuing its destructive work. Thus, the eternal question, shrouded in mystery, arises: who was responsible for this colossal disaster? If one disregards the well-known fact that fires were very common in ancient Rome, with many outbreaks occurring daily, and the vast majority of Roman buildings constructed largely from wood, then 2 main suspects emerge. For the past 2 millennia, the widespread belief has dominated that Emperor Nero himself initiated the Great Fire and supposedly played the lyre while the city was engulfed in flames. However, at least one of these myths can be dispelled immediately: the violin, or fiddle, as such, would not exist for another 1500 years. If Nero indeed played any instrument, it would most likely have been a lyre. Furthermore, Nero was not even in the city when the fire broke out. He only returned to Rome when he realized his own property was at risk. Notably, the night the fire began was a full moon, which would have made it an extremely poor choice if the emperor wished his supposed accomplices to remain unnoticed. Nero lacked clear motives to have initiated such a grand fire. Some researchers suggest his goal was to reshape Rome according to his own vision. However, it should be noted that the construction projects he himself had already begun in the city were severely damaged by the fire. Moreover, the location where Nero undertook his massive construction projects after the disaster does not align at all with the actual origin of the fire, making this theory quite illogical. The second probable suspect in the context of the Great Fire of 64 AD was the Christians, then a small but radical group who had arrived from Judea. In Christian tradition, Nero's figure often appears as the Antichrist, almost the embodiment of the devil himself. Notably, the Bible itself repeatedly mentions fire and brimstone raining down on unbelievers. Perhaps some Christians interpreted these prophecies literally and took matters into their own hands. The true cause remains unknown, and it is likely we will never be able to ascertain it. Ultimately, Nero either truly used Christians as scapegoats, or they were indeed guilty themselves, but either way, that is when the first large-scale Roman persecutions of Christians began. According to tradition, it was during this period that St. Peter and St. Paul were executed. On the site where the Vatican now stands, there was once a vast circus where Nero organized public executions of Christians. Some of them were burned alive, a punishment symbolically corresponding to the arson attributed to them, while others were thrown to wild beasts. Prior to that historical moment, the development of the city of Rome had occurred largely organically, often leading to chaotic construction. Many of its streets were narrow and winding, resembling cramped alleys rather than broad avenues. However, this grand disaster that befell the capital provided Emperor Nero with an unprecedented opportunity to rebuild Rome according to his own vision and grandeur. He immediately began construction of a grandiose palace complex, known as the Golden House, which occupied a vast area where the Colosseum now stands. In the same area, Nero ordered a 35-meter statue of himself to be erected. It is noteworthy that the modern Colosseum derived its current name precisely from this colossal statue, which stood in close proximity to the future amphitheater. The reconstruction of the devastated city required colossal financial investment, and Nero, seeking to raise the necessary funds, introduced forced contributions, levying them upon the empire's provinces. Each province was obliged to contribute to the collective efforts to rebuild the capital. The emperor also resorted to confiscating land and, crucially, debasing the currency to replenish the treasury. The debasement of the currency, undoubtedly, set a highly unfavorable precedent for future economic stability. All these measures, undertaken to finance the large-scale construction, naturally did nothing to increase his popularity among the populace. His authority in the Senate by then was at a record low. In managing the vast empire, Nero preferred to rely on his freedmen, entrusting them with key positions. He even appointed one of them prefect of Egypt, the empire's wealthiest province, which was a highly unusual move. Soon after, the first major conspiracy against the emperor was uncovered, involving at least 5 senators and numerous members of the equestrian order. The conspirators planned to overthrow Nero and place a man named Gaius Calpurnius Piso on the throne. It is important to note that Piso had no familial ties to the ruling Julio-Claudian dynasty. In fact, Nero had by then quite effectively eliminated anyone who might lay claim to the throne with any dynastic connection. However, the treacherous plot failed, and all those involved were either exiled or executed. This failure instilled deep superstition and intensified his paranoia. The emperor hired even more spies, and his trusted Praetorian prefect, Tigellinus, relentlessly hunted down anyone who aroused the slightest suspicion. Thus, a group of Stoic philosophers, led by a former consul, was put to death for reasons that remained unknown. However, justifications for executions were not always necessary. Some were killed under the pretext of conduct unworthy of a loyal subject. Nero's new wife, Poppaea, frequently quarreled with him over his excessive passion for racing, and one day, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, Nero fatally beat his then pregnant wife. She died in 65 AD, and her demise plunged Nero into a state of deep grief. After this, he planned an extensive trip to Greece, where he intended to visit all the great festivals and participate in all the games. All competitions were forcibly rescheduled to coincide with his arrival. He stayed in Greece for a full year and managed to win 1,800 competitions, taking first prizes, an impressive feat, considering he didn't even participate in that many games. Nero was a true Philhellene, a passionate admirer of all things Hellenic, and upon concluding his tour of Greece, he solemnly declared Greece free once more, releasing it from the obligation to pay tribute to Rome. It is believed that Nero also planned to visit Egypt. However, gripped by growing anxiety about remaining away from the capital for too long, he returned to Rome. The threat of another conspiracy seemed too serious to him. In 66 AD, a large-scale rebellion erupted in Judea. The roots of this conflict were deep and multifaceted, tensions were extremely high between the Greek and Jewish populations, as well as between Christians and Jews, rapidly plunging the province into a state of profound destabilization. The situation worsened when the Jewish high priest defiantly refused to perform traditional sacrifices in honor of the emperor. Soon after, widespread riots broke out in Caesarea, and the Roman garrison stationed in Jerusalem was almost entirely annihilated. About 3,000 people perished. When a legion based in Syria moved to suppress the rebellion, its soldiers fell into a deadly ambush set by Jewish rebels and were ruthlessly annihilated, their sacred Aquila, symbolizing the might of Rome, captured as a trophy. In response to these audacious actions, Emperor Nero immediately dispatched Vespasian to the region, appointing his son Titus as his deputy to lead the punitive operation. Vespasian, despite his habit of dozing during Nero's public performances, proved highly successful in service during this emperor's reign. He was recognized as a highly competent military commander, possessing extensive experience gained both on the Germanic frontier and in fierce battles in Britain. Vespasian was granted 4 legions to subdue the rebellious province. In 67 AD, he entered the region and methodically took one city after another, leaving Roman troops as garrisons, but deliberately bypassing the well-fortified city of Jerusalem. Inside Jerusalem itself, in any case, absolute anarchy reigned, various factions fought irreconcilably for dominance. As Vespasian achieved victories, more and more refugees flocked to Jerusalem, but due to significant political turmoil in Rome, military operations were temporarily suspended. Emperor Nero, returning to Rome in early 68 AD, was not met with the lavish triumphal ceremonies customary for rulers. The capital was in deep discontent, the populace suffered from a severe food shortage, while the Senate and aristocracy harbored profound animosity towards his populist overtures to the plebs. In response to the escalating problems, Nero undertook virtually no efforts to resolve the situation. Instead of attending to state affairs, he chose to withdraw to Naples, where he soon received alarming news that the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, Gaius Julius Vindex, had launched a rebellion. The true motives behind Vindex's uprising remained obscure. As a Romanized Gaul, he likely wavered between a desire for Gallic liberation from Roman rule and a simple wish for a change of emperor. Vindex, seeking to strengthen his position, sent messages to other governors, soliciting their cooperation. His appeal was answered by Servius Sulpicius Galba, then governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, who publicly declared his solidarity with the rebel. However, not all provincial governors in Gaul or Germany expressed support for Vindex. Specifically, the governor of Upper Germany marched his legions against Vindex, leading to a direct confrontation. The details of this conflict remain not entirely clear, but the ultimate and tragic outcome was Vindex's suicide, marking the end of his rebellion. This event placed Galba in an extremely vulnerable and uncertain position, so much so that he seriously considered taking his own life. Nevertheless, Galba soon gained significant support from both the Senate and Otho, Poppaea Sabina's former husband, who at that time held the position of governor of Lusitania. At that time, Nero was hiding in a villa located outside majestic Rome. Upon receiving news that the Roman Senate had officially declared him an enemy of the state, and fully realizing the inevitability of his end, he succumbed to deep sorrow, lamenting not his own demise but the imagined loss that, in his view, the entire world would suffer. What an artist the world loses in me. No sooner had these dramatic words left his lips than he committed suicide, with the assistance of a slave who plunged a sharp sword into the body of the 30-year-old emperor. Thus concluded the reign of the last representative of the Julio-Claudian dynasty to ever sit on the imperial throne. This tragic event occurred on June 9, 68 AD. Shortly thereafter, Galba was formally proclaimed the new emperor of Rome, marking a change of power.